The morning my neighbor Karen discovered that custom clothing alterations were costing $300 per item, and professional seamstresses were booked months in advance, while my home sewing workshop that she'd spent 6 months trying to eliminate was providing affordable clothing solutions for families struggling with fashion inflation. She realized that sometimes traditional skills beat aesthetic concerns when economic reality affects your wardrobe budget. But wait until you hear what happened when rising fashion costs exposed not just the failure of Karen's noise complaints, but also her scheme to profit from neighborhood textile contracts while blocking residents from developing affordable clothing solutions that could have saved families thousands during the fashion accessibility crisis. If you enjoy seeing justice served, click the subscribe button for more. Picture this. It's a typical Tuesday morning in Riverside Heights, Tennessee, and I'm setting up my sewing machines before starting another day of helping families maintain professional wardrobes without paying the increasingly expensive commercial tailoring rates. The gentle hum of my serger and the rhythmic clicking of my industrial sewing machine fill the converted spare bedroom as I prepare custom alterations and clothing repairs. I'm Maria Santos, 39 years old, and I work as a professional fashion designer and seamstress instructor. My husband Carlos runs a small construction business. We're regular folks trying to maintain professional appearances in Tennessee, where custom clothing costs have doubled over the past 2 years, and simple alterations now cost more than many families' monthly clothing budgets. The sewing workshop in our spare bedroom isn't anything fancy, just professional-grade machines, including a straight stitch, serger, embroidery machine, and cutting table with proper lighting. This setup allows me to provide alterations, custom clothing, and repairs at a fraction of commercial rates while maintaining the quality that professional wardrobes require. This morning's work showed exactly what I hope to achieve: quality clothing services that cost 60% less than commercial tailors while providing the same professional results. We were helping neighborhood families maintain business attire and special occasion clothing without the financial strain that expensive tailoring creates. That peaceful morning routine was shattered by the aggressive sound of heels clicking across our hardwood floors, and a voice that carried the particular authority of someone who'd clearly been building up to a confrontation for weeks. "Maria!" Karen Wilson called out as she approached my sewing room, carrying a folder and wearing the kind of determined expression that meant someone was about to have their workday interrupted. "We need to discuss your textile operations situation." Karen Wilson was 46 years old, a retail consultant who'd moved to Tennessee from New York 3 years ago. She drove a silver Mercedes C-Class that was always spotless, lived in the most expensive house in our neighborhood, and had somehow gotten herself elected HOA president despite understanding absolutely nothing about fashion economics or the challenges that rising clothing costs created for working families. "Morning, Karen," I replied, setting down my fabric scissors and preparing for what I figured would be another complaint about something completely reasonable that she'd decided was problematic. "I've been getting complaints from neighbors," Karen announced, opening her folder with the satisfaction of someone who'd been collecting evidence. "Your commercial sewing operation is creating noise pollution that's affecting quality of life, and several residents are concerned about business zoning violations and property value impacts." I looked at her for a moment, trying to process the phrase commercial operation being applied to basic clothing maintenance during an era when professional tailoring had become unaffordable for most families. We were living in a state where fashion costs were skyrocketing, where simple alterations required weeks of waiting, and where families were struggling to maintain professional wardrobes without breaking their budgets. "Karen, this is a home sewing workshop for clothing alterations and repairs. It helps families maintain professional appearance without paying $300 for simple alterations. It's actually exactly what fashion professionals recommend for affordable wardrobe maintenance." "That's the problem," Karen shot back, warming to her prepared argument. "When residents start installing commercial textile equipment, it makes the neighborhood look like we're operating some kind of garment district facility. This is a premium residential community, not a clothing manufacturing compound." The conversation was already surreal. Karen was calling basic sewing equipment commercial textile operations and complaining that affordable clothing services made our neighborhood look like we were in manufacturing crisis, while clothing costs were literally creating a fashion accessibility crisis for working families. "Besides," Karen continued, clearly building toward her main point. I've researched the regulations, and residential textile operations require permits and safety inspections that you don't have. You're operating unauthorized equipment in violation of business licensing and commercial activity codes. This was interesting. Karen was making claims about sewing regulations that I knew were wrong because fashion design and clothing alteration were literally my profession. Tennessee has some of the most supportive home-based business laws in the country, specifically because of our emphasis on traditional crafts and entrepreneurship. Karen, residential sewing operations under commercial thresholds don't require special permits in Tennessee. The state actually encourages them through small business incentives and craft preservation programs. Well, that's not what I was told, Karen replied, though her tone suggested less confidence than before. And regardless of permits, the HOA has standards about residential noise that your industrial equipment clearly violates. Did you speak with someone at the county business office who specifically handles home-based textile work? Or did you talk to general staff who might not be familiar with sewing regulations? Karen's pause suggested she'd done exactly what I suspected, called random county offices, without talking to anyone who actually understood fashion business policy or craft regulations. The main issue, she continued, avoiding my question about her research, is that your textile operation creates unfair advantages that affect community fashion standards and neighborhood tranquility. When some residents start operating personal tailoring services, it puts pressure on others to compete or creates anxiety about clothing access that affects everyone's quality of life. This statement was so wrong it was almost educational. Home sewing actually improves community fashion by making clothing maintenance more accessible and affordable for families who can't afford $300 alterations. It's literally the opposite of what Karen was claiming. Karen, home sewing improves community fashion by making clothing maintenance accessible to families who can't afford expensive commercial tailoring. It actually helps everyone's wardrobe outcomes while reducing financial stress. That sounds like fashion theory, Karen dismissed. But the practical reality is that your sewing machines make neighbors feel like they need to compete for clothing services or worry about fashion disparities in residential areas. It creates anxiety about wardrobe availability that affects everyone's peace of mind. I realized that Karen's opposition wasn't based on regulations or a community impact. It was based on her fundamental discomfort with visible reminders that fashion wasn't universally accessible and that families might need to take responsibility for their own clothing maintenance during times when commercial tailoring services were becoming unaffordable. Besides, Karen added, clearly preparing her closing argument, premium residential communities should rely on professional fashion services and commercial tailoring facilities, not individual clothing preparations that make neighborhoods look like textile necessity zones. Karen had made her position clear. She opposed home sewing because it looked like preparation for fashion problems she didn't want to acknowledge. She wanted me to remove equipment that saved money and helped families maintain professional appearance, because it reminded her that Tennessee was experiencing serious clothing cost increases that affected fashion accessibility. I made a decision that would prove crucial in everything that followed. Karen, I understand your noise concerns, but I'm not removing sewing equipment that helps families maintain professional wardrobes and saves them thousands annually. If you want to file HOA complaints or county reports, that's your choice. But I'm not eliminating practical clothing solutions for aesthetic reasons. Karen's expression shifted from confident authority to genuine irritation. Fine. But don't expect neighborhood support when your survival tailoring installations start affecting everyone else's property values. And don't come asking for community help when your textile noise pollution creates problems for residential tranquility. She marched back toward her house with that stiff-backed walk that suggested I'd just made a serious enemy over what she considered selfish fashion hoarding. That evening, over dinner with Carlos and the kids, I explained Karen's visit and what it might mean for our family's relationship with the HOA. Mom, are we really running a clothing factory? Isabella asked, having overheard enough of Karen's complaints to be concerned about our family's sewing activities. Carlos, who'd been tracking our household budget and knew exactly how much the home sewing saved us monthly, answered with the practical certainty that had made me fall in love with him 18 years earlier. Isabella, Diego, Your mother's sewing workshop saves our family about $250 every month on clothing costs. That's money we can use for things like your school activities and college savings instead of paying expensive tailors for services we can provide ourselves. But Mrs. Wilson says we're making the neighborhood look bad, Diego added, having apparently heard Karen's aesthetic complaints during one of her property inspection walks. Mrs. Wilson moved here from New York, where fashion costs are different and clothing access isn't as challenging, I explained. She doesn't understand that in Tennessee, home sewing isn't about looking bad. It's about practical wardrobe management and family financial responsibility. The conversation reminded me why I'd built the sewing workshop in the first place. This wasn't about preparing for fashion emergencies. It was about practical family budgeting during a time when basic clothing services were becoming increasingly expensive for working families. Over the following weeks, Karen's campaign against my sewing equipment escalated with the systematic determination of someone who'd decided that eliminating visible clothing preparations was essential to maintaining community property values. She organized what she called Phase 2 of her campaign to restore neighborhood fashion standards and residential tranquility. Karen began hosting weekly community fashion standards meetings at her house, where she presented increasingly sophisticated arguments against individual sewing equipment. These meetings featured detailed PowerPoint presentations showing property value studies from other communities, noise ordinance interpretations, and psychological research about how fashion anxiety could affect neighborhood mental health. Karen had clearly invested significant time researching ammunition for her anti-sewing campaign. She distributed professional-looking flyers throughout Riverside Heights titled "Protecting Our Community: The Hidden Costs of Residential Textile Operations." These flyers included carefully selected statistics about home business insurance complications, noise pollution studies from industrial areas that she'd somehow applied to residential sewing equipment, and zoning violation concerns. Karen's most concerning escalation involved contacting parents throughout the neighborhood to express worry about the competitive pressure that home sewing might create for children. She apparently believed that visible clothing equipment made kids feel inadequate if their families couldn't afford similar fashion services. "I'm just concerned about the message we're sending to our children," Karen told Jennifer Martinez, Isabella's friend's mother, during one of these conversations. "When some families have these elaborate sewing operations and others don't, it creates class divisions that affect kids' fashion self-esteem." But Karen's most systematic approach involved building alliances with commercial tailoring businesses throughout the area. She contacted clothing alteration shops, custom tailors, and fashion boutiques, presenting herself as a community advocate fighting against unfair competition from residential sewing operations. Several business owners, apparently convinced by Karen's presentation about home sewing undermining their commercial models, began supporting her campaign with professional testimony about the dangers of unsupervised alterations and the necessity of professional fashion guidance. Karen even organized what she called the Riverside Heights Professional Fashion Coalition, bringing together commercial clothing providers to develop talking points about why residential sewing equipment posed community fashion risks. The coalition produced official-looking documents claiming that home sewing violated liability standards, created insurance complications, and potentially endangered clothing quality without professional supervision. These documents were distributed throughout the neighborhood as expert analysis of residential fashion risks. Most troubling, Karen began conducting what she called fashion assessments of neighborhood properties, walking through Riverside Heights with a clipboard and camera, documenting every piece of visible sewing equipment, while taking notes about noise levels and aesthetic impacts. She created detailed maps showing the location of every sewing machine, cutting table, and fabric storage area in our community, presenting this data as evidence of textile proliferation that was changing the character of our residential neighborhood. Karen's documentation efforts extended to monitoring my family's sewing schedule, noting the times when we used equipment and correlating these with alleged noise complaints from anonymous neighbors who somehow always seemed to call Karen rather than contacting us directly. She began filing weekly reports with the HOA board about ongoing textile operation violations, creating an official paper trail that she clearly intended to use in future legal proceedings against our home sewing workshop. But Karen's most serious escalation came when she hired a private attorney specializing in neighborhood disputes to help her build a legal case against residential sewing equipment throughout Riverside Heights. The attorney, Patricia Henderson from Henderson and Associates, specialized in HOA enforcement and commercial zoning cases. Karen had clearly decided that defeating home sewing required professional legal expertise rather than just community pressure. Henderson began sending official letters to families with sewing equipment, claiming that residential textile operations violated deed restrictions, noise ordinances, and commercial activity standards. Her letters demanded immediate removal of sewing equipment or legal action would follow. The letters included threatening language about property liens, HOA fines, and potential lawsuits that could force families to pay legal costs, even if they ultimately prevailed in court. Henderson was using intimidation tactics to pressure neighbors into compliance. My family received one of these letters on a Wednesday morning, delivered by certified mail with language demanding removal of all sewing equipment within 30 days or face immediate legal proceedings. Dear Miss Santos, the letter began, you are hereby notified that your residential textile operation violates multiple community standards and poses ongoing liability risks to Riverside Heights residents. Immediate compliance is required to avoid legal action. The letter included detailed allegations about noise violations, safety hazards, and insurance complications that would supposedly result from our home sewing workshop. Henderson had clearly done extensive research into potential legal challenges to residential fashion work. Most concerning, the letter threatened to involve the Tennessee Department of Labor if we continued operating unauthorized clothing production without proper commercial licensing, claiming that home alterations posed worker safety risks, even though we were the only workers involved. This threat crossed a line that transformed Karen's aesthetic complaints into attacks on our family's livelihood and professional credentials. She was now using government agencies as weapons against families who chose home sewing over commercial tailoring services. When I consulted with Jennifer Roberts at the county's small business office about Henderson's legal threats, she expressed surprise at the aggressive tactics being used against residential sewing operations. Maria, Jennifer said, I've been dealing with Tennessee's small business policy for 10 years, and I've never seen legal challenges to home sewing that meet safety standards. Someone's really invested in stopping residential fashion work in your neighborhood. Jennifer's observation made me realize that Karen's campaign had evolved far beyond simple noise complaints or aesthetic concerns. She was spending significant money on legal fees and professional consultation to eliminate home sewing throughout our community. The question was why someone would invest thousands of dollars in attorney fees to stop neighbors from maintaining their own clothing. Karen's motivation seemed disproportionate to the actual impact of residential sewing equipment. That's when I began investigating the financial connections behind Karen's anti-sewing campaign and discovered the textile fraud scheme that explained her desperate opposition to anything that might give residents expertise in fashion and clothing economics. During this same period, I'd been noticing irregularities in neighborhood fashion consultation contracts that didn't match normal service patterns. Several neighbors mentioned unusually high style consulting costs, and the community wardrobe program seemed inconsistent with actual services being provided. As a professional fashion designer, I had access to regional clothing databases that showed fashion costs throughout Tennessee communities. When I ran analysis on our neighborhood style consultation expenses versus actual services provided, the numbers didn't add up. Our community was being charged for significantly more fashion consulting than municipal records showed we were receiving. Someone was inflating style service costs and pocketing the difference, a scheme that could only work if residents weren't developing their own fashion expertise or questioning professional clothing bills. The person running this fashion fraud needed neighbors who weren't monitoring clothing costs, who weren't developing sewing knowledge, and who weren't questioning unusually high consultation bills. Karen's campaign against home sewing wasn't just about noise concerns. It was about maintaining the conditions that allowed her fashion manipulation to continue undetected. That's when the clothing cost crisis hit with full force, and Karen's world started falling apart in ways she never saw coming. The economic crisis that struck the fashion industry created clothing costs that exposed both Karen's fashion fraud and the critical importance of the home sewing systems she'd been trying to eliminate. Custom clothing alterations jumped to $300 per item for basic services, with specialized tailoring reaching $500 for complex work. Fashion boutiques began implementing premium pricing for consultations, fittings, and wardrobe planning that had previously been included in standard services. For families with home sewing equipment, these cost increases were manageable. Our workshop provided all essential clothing services without hourly fees, and our home setup offered the same quality results as commercial tailors without the financial strain. But for families like Karen's, who'd relied entirely on commercial fashion services and professional style consultations, the cost increases created immediate crisis conditions. Karen's clothing bills skyrocketed to over $800 per month as she tried to maintain her previous wardrobe standards through commercial services. Her fashion consultation costs jumped to levels that strained even her retail consultant income, while her clothing quality declined due to reduced professional maintenance frequency. More importantly, the fashion crisis exposed Karen's style manipulation scheme when community auditors began investigating clothing service cost discrepancies throughout our region. State consumer protection investigators discovered that Karen had been inflating neighborhood fashion bills by reporting false consultation services to community-style budgets and pocketing the difference through shell companies she controlled. The scheme had been generating nearly $95,000 annually in fraudulent billing throughout our community. The investigation revealed that Karen's opposition to home sewing wasn't about noise concerns or community standards. It was about preventing residents from developing fashion expertise and discovering her style fraud. When families develop clothing knowledge through home sewing, they notice discrepancies between actual fashion needs and professional service billing. Karen's fraud could only continue if neighbors remained dependent on professional services and unaware of actual clothing costs. The first sign that Karen's world was collapsing came on a Thursday morning when I found her standing at my front door at 7 a.m., looking genuinely panicked for the first time since I'd known her. "Maria," she said, her voice lacking the confident authority I'd grown accustomed to hearing, "I need to ask you about something. My clothing costs, they're completely out of control." I looked at her standing there with papers in her hand, papers that I suspected were service bills she could no longer afford, and investigation notices she couldn't ignore. "What kind of problems are you seeing, Karen?" "My alteration bill hit $347 last month, and style consulting is costing me over $800 monthly," she said, her words coming quickly as if she was still processing the financial reality. "The fashion companies are threatening to cancel services if I don't pay, but I can't afford these amounts. I don't understand how clothing maintenance can cost this much." I could see the weight of multiple crises converging in her expression, the realization that her fashion bills were unaffordable, that her wardrobe was suffering despite expensive professional services, and that the home sewing equipment she'd opposed was the only thing keeping other families from facing similar disaster. "How much are you actually spending annually on fashion and clothing services?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would reveal the full scope of her problems. "I don't know," Karen replied. "I never tracked total clothing costs before. I just paid whatever the companies said I owed. But now, with the price increases and these massive bills, I can't keep up with payments." This was the moment when 6 months of opposing home sewing collided with the reality of Tennessee fashion economics and Karen's own style fraud being investigated by state authorities. "Karen," I said gently, "I think we need to look at your actual clothing needs versus what you're being charged and figure out how to implement sewing solutions that can maintain your wardrobe without massive professional service costs." What we discovered during that review was a family crisis created by both fashion cost inflation and Karen's own fraudulent billing practices coming back to destroy her finances. Karen's style bills showed consultation services that were physically impossible to provide at the reported frequency, evidence of the billing manipulation that was now being investigated by state consumer fraud investigators. She'd been inflating her own bills along with everyone else's, but she'd also been spending the fraudulent proceeds on maintaining unsustainable fashion services that required massive professional costs. When clothing prices skyrocketed, Karen couldn't maintain her wardrobe standards without professional services that cost thousands monthly. Her style consulting business was failing as clients discovered her fraudulent billing, while her personal clothing required expensive maintenance she could no longer afford. Most critically, Karen had no home sewing infrastructure to help manage clothing costs during the economic crisis that made professional fashion services unaffordable for most families. "I don't understand how this happened," Karen said, as we reviewed her billing and clothing data. "I was trying to maintain community standards and prevent noise pollution, but now I'm the one facing financial crisis from fashion costs." "Karen, the home sewing systems you opposed weren't about noise pollution. They were about practical preparation for exactly the economic conditions we're facing now. Rising clothing costs aren't a crisis you can prevent through aesthetic standards. It's an economic challenge you manage through preparation and traditional skills." Over the following weeks, as Karen's legal troubles intensified and her financial situation deteriorated, she began to understand the connections between fashion independence, financial planning, and community resilience during challenging economic conditions. The state fashion fraud investigation resulted in criminal charges against Karen for billing manipulation, restitution requirements exceeding $135,000, and immediate termination from her HOA position. Her style consulting license was suspended pending resolution of fraud charges. But perhaps most importantly for our neighborhood, Karen's legal troubles led to comprehensive fashion billing audits that corrected fraudulent charges and reduced clothing service costs for every family in our community. The corrected billing, combined with fashion accessibility policies that encouraged home sewing, created financial incentives for residents to implement exactly the clothing maintenance systems that Karen had spent months opposing. 6 months after her arrest, Karen contacted me requesting help with installing sewing equipment for her property. The financial necessity of fashion independence had overcome her aesthetic objections to visible sewing infrastructure. "Maria," she said during our conversation about setting up sewing equipment at her house, "I want you to know that I was completely wrong about home sewing and its importance for family financial security. I didn't understand that fashion independence isn't about noise pollution. It's about practical preparation for predictable economic challenges." The installation of Karen's sewing workshop became a neighborhood education opportunity, demonstrating how clothing equipment, fashion knowledge, and wardrobe monitoring could reduce clothing costs while supporting community fashion goals. But perhaps the most meaningful change came when Karen began advocating for fashion accessibility, education, and community clothing independence throughout our region. "I learned through financial crisis and legal consequences," Karen would tell audiences of homeowners and HOA boards, "that opposing practical fashion solutions because they look like textile crisis preparation can create actual crisis when economic challenges arrive. Home sewing isn't about fear, it's about responsible wardrobe management and family financial security." Today, our neighborhood has become a model for suburban fashion accessibility and clothing independence in Tennessee. Most homes have some form of sewing equipment, and the Community Association provides education about clothing techniques and financial benefits of fashion self-reliance. Karen Wilson serves as a volunteer coordinator for the Riverside Heights Fashion Independence Project, working with county extension offices and state craft agencies to help families implement sewing solutions and avoid the financial crisis she experienced. The transformation has been remarkable. From a community that opposed home sewing as unnecessary noise pollution to a neighborhood that's become a regional example of how suburban residents can achieve fashion security while reducing clothing costs. But the long-term impact of Karen's fraud case and our neighborhood's transformation extended far beyond Riverside Heights. The investigation led to statewide policy changes regarding community fashion service, billing oversight, and residential sewing support. The Tennessee Consumer Protection Commission used our case as the foundation for the Community Fashion Transparency Act, legislation that required independent auditing of neighborhood-style service billing and created protection mechanisms for communities targeted by fashion fraud schemes. I was invited to testify before the Tennessee legislature during consideration of the Community Fashion Transparency Act, representing families who had discovered billing fraud through sewing monitoring and fashion self-reliance. Karen's fraud scheme succeeded for 2 years because residents weren't monitoring their actual clothing costs, I told the legislative committee. When families implement home sewing systems, they become naturally aware of fashion needs that make billing fraud detectable. Fashion independence isn't just about clothing accessibility, it's about financial protection for residential communities. The legislation passed with bipartisan support and became a model for similar laws in other fashion-challenged states throughout the South. Federal consumer agencies began promoting residential sewing education as essential infrastructure for both fashion accessibility and fraud prevention. Karen's transformation during this period became equally comprehensive. While serving her community service sentence for fashion fraud, she completed certification as a fashion independent specialist through the state craft program. I have unique credibility when I talk to communities about the importance of clothing monitoring, Karen explained during one of her educational presentations. I can honestly say that I was wrong about home sewing being unnecessary, and I can show exactly how opposing practical fashion independence can create the conditions that allow fraud and financial crisis to develop. Her presentations included detailed case studies of our neighborhood's billing fraud, showing how sewing expertise had exposed the scheme and protected families from continued financial exploitation. The before and after financial analysis provided compelling evidence that fashion independence created economic benefits beyond simple clothing cost savings. Karen also worked with law enforcement agencies throughout Tennessee to develop fraud prevention education programs, helping communities recognize billing irregularities and implement monitoring systems that could detect fashion fraud before it caused serious financial damage. 3 years after her conviction, Karen completed her community service requirements and began working as a paid consultant for fashion independence education programs throughout the South. Her personal experience with both fraud and financial crisis made her an effective advocate for practical clothing self-reliance. My billing fraud cost families in our community over $200,000 in false charges, Karen would tell audiences of municipal officials and community leaders. But the home sewing systems I opposed would have exposed my scheme within months if residents had been developing fashion expertise. Communities that implement sewing education protect themselves from both clothing cost inflation and financial fraud. 5 years after the fashion crisis and fraud investigation, Riverside Heights hosted the first annual Tennessee Community Fashion Independence Conference, bringing together clothing professionals, sewing educators, and community advocates from throughout the state. The conference featured presentations on residential sewing technology, billing fraud prevention, and community resilience during fashion cost inflation. But the most powerful sessions came from families who had experienced both clothing challenges and financial fraud, providing first-hand accounts of how fashion independence and clothing monitoring could protect communities from multiple threats. Isabella and Diego, now 19 and 16, participated in the conference as youth advocates for fashion education and financial literacy. Their presentation, titled Growing Up Fashion Independent: How Clothing Awareness Shapes Community Responsibility, address the educational benefits that children experience when families prioritize practical wardrobe management. Living through our neighborhood's fashion crisis and fraud taught us that clothing independence isn't about restriction or fear, Isabella told the conference audience. It's about understanding how fashion systems work, so families can make informed decisions that protect both wardrobe quality and financial security. Diego added, when communities develop sewing expertise and understand their actual clothing costs, they become resistant to both fashion inflation and economic exploitation. Clothing education creates informed citizens who can protect themselves and their neighbors from multiple threats. The conference concluded with the announcement of the Tennessee Community Fashion Resilience Institute, a joint project between the State Consumer Protection Agency, University of Tennessee fashion programs, and community sewing organizations. The institute would develop improved clothing technologies while documenting best practices for community-wide fashion independence and fraud prevention. I was appointed as the institute's founding fashion director, a position that allowed me to expand community clothing research beyond Tennessee to fashion challenge regions throughout the southern United States. The Institute's first major project involved documenting community resilience during the Riverside Heights fashion crisis and fraud investigation, plus similar challenges in other residential areas that had experienced both clothing, cost inflation, and financial exploitation. The research confirmed that sewing education could improve community resilience by 80 to 95% compared to areas that relied solely on professional fashion services without resident expertise. More importantly, The research demonstrated that communities with active home sewing programs showed significantly lower rates of fashion service fraud, clothing cost vulnerability, and economic instability during wardrobe crises. The Institute also developed standardized guidelines for residential sewing systems, making effective fashion independence more accessible to families without advanced clothing knowledge. The guidelines included detailed specifications for different climate regions, sewing technologies, and community coordination systems. But perhaps the most significant research finding involved the educational and community benefits of fashion awareness. Families with home sewing systems showed increased understanding of clothing principles, greater community engagement during challenges, and improved financial literacy regarding fashion costs and clothing economics. Today, 14 years after Karen's fraud conviction and our fashion crisis, over 90% of Tennessee's suburban communities have some form of resident-supported clothing program. Property values in fashion-independent neighborhoods significantly exceed values in areas that rely solely on professional services without resident involvement. The transformation has been so comprehensive that new residents moving to Tennessee communities routinely ask about sewing programs and fashion education opportunities during home purchasing decisions. Real estate agents now market community clothing infrastructure as premium features that provide both wardrobe benefits and financial protection. Isabella and Diego, now working as fashion consultants specializing in community clothing management, credit their experience with our neighborhood's crisis for shaping their professional dedication to sewing education and economic resilience. Growing up during fashion cost inflation and fraud taught us that clothing challenges and financial threats often occur simultaneously. Isabella explained during a recent interview about her work developing community sewing programs. Fashion independence education helps communities prepare for both wardrobe and economic challenges rather than addressing them separately. Diego, who specializes in residential sewing technology and fraud prevention systems, added, "Our neighborhood's experience showed that practical clothing management and financial protection aren't separate concerns. They're integrated approaches to community resilience that protect families from multiple threats." Karen Wilson, now 60 and recognized as one of Tennessee's leading fashion independence educators, frequently speaks about the connections between clothing self-reliance, financial security, and community fraud prevention. "I learned through personal crisis and legal consequences that opposing practical sewing creates vulnerability to both fashion challenges and economic exploitation," she tells audiences of community leaders, municipal officials, and fashion advocates. Clothing independence education isn't about fear or restriction. It's about creating informed communities that can protect themselves from predictable threats. Her presentations always include the fundamental lesson that our neighborhood's crisis taught everyone involved. Fashion independence and financial monitoring aren't separate activities. They're complementary approaches to community security that protect families from both clothing challenges and economic fraud that often target the same vulnerable populations. But the most profound impact has been on how Tennessee approaches community resilience education and fashion security planning. The Riverside Heights case study is now required curriculum in municipal management programs throughout the state, teaching future city planners and community leaders about the connections between fashion education, fraud prevention, and economic security. The Tennessee Department of Consumer Affairs has established the Community Fashion Independence Initiative, a $45 million program that provides funding and technical assistance for residential sewing programs, billing monitoring systems, and community education projects throughout the state. I've been serving as the initiative's technical advisor, helping communities implement clothing programs that provide both fashion benefits and economic protection from service fraud and clothing cost inflation. The initiative has supported over 380 communities in developing integrated sewing and monitoring programs, with documented results showing average household savings of $225 monthly on clothing costs, plus protection from billing fraud schemes that had been targeting communities without active fashion monitoring. More importantly, communities participating in the initiative show significantly higher levels of civic engagement, community cooperation, and economic resilience during both fashion challenges and economic downturns. Carlos, who has been working as a financial consultant specializing in household clothing budgeting, credits our family's experience with fashion independence for shaping his understanding of how clothing awareness affects family financial security. Maria's sewing workshop didn't just save us money on clothing bills, he explains to families seeking financial counseling. It taught our entire family that fashion awareness and financial planning are connected skills that create economic security rather than separate concerns that compete for attention. Carlos's practice now specializes in helping families implement sewing solutions as part of comprehensive financial planning, showing clients how clothing investments provide both wardrobe benefits and economic protection that traditional financial instruments can't offer. The long-term economic data from our neighborhood supports Carlos's approach. Families who implemented home sewing before the cost crisis and fraud investigation showed 50% less financial stress during fashion emergencies, 70% lower clothing costs during crisis periods, and significantly higher long-term savings rates compared to families who relied solely on traditional financial planning without fashion consideration. Isabella and Diego have taken their childhood experience with fashion education and applied it to their adult careers in ways that continue expanding the impact of clothing awareness throughout Tennessee and beyond. Isabella's fashion consulting firm specializes in helping communities develop sewing education and programs that integrate clothing independence with economic security and fraud prevention. Her work has influenced fashion policy in 20 states and 3 countries. Our childhood experience with fashion, cost inflation, and fraud taught me that clothing challenges and economic threats often target the same vulnerable populations, Isabella says. Effective sewing education must address both fashion resilience and economic protection to create truly sustainable communities. Diego's technology company develops software systems that help communities monitor clothing costs and detect service billing irregularities before they become major fraud schemes. His monitoring systems are now used by over 650 communities throughout the southern United States. The billing fraud that targeted our neighborhood succeeded because residents weren't monitoring their actual fashion costs, Diego explains. Technology can make clothing monitoring as simple as checking your bank account, giving families the information they need to protect themselves from both fashion challenges and economic fraud. The software Diego developed provides real-time cost analysis, billing verification, and sewing optimization that helps families reduce clothing expenses while detecting potential fraud before it creates serious financial damage. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of our family's approach to fashion independence came 9 years ago, when the Tennessee Governor's Office recognized Riverside Heights as the state's model community for integrated clothing resilience and economic protection. Governor Davis visited our neighborhood during the recognition ceremony, touring sewing installations and meeting with families who had benefited from both fashion independence and fraud prevention programs. What happened in Riverside Heights represents the future of community resilience, Governor Davis said during her visit. When residents understand clothing management and monitor their fashion costs, they create communities that are resistant to both wardrobe challenges and economic exploitation. This is how Tennessee communities can thrive during uncertain times. The governor's recognition led to increased state funding for community sewing programs and federal attention to Tennessee's integrated approach to fashion independence and fraud prevention. Our neighborhood has hosted delegations from municipal leaders throughout the United States and internationally, with visitors studying how sewing education can create both wardrobe benefits and economic protection for residential communities. The most frequent question from visiting delegations involves the connection between fashion awareness and fraud prevention. Many communities struggle with service fraud, but hadn't considered how clothing education could provide protection from economic exploitation. Sewing expertise gives residents the information they need to verify service billing accuracy, I explained to visiting officials. When families understand their actual clothing needs, they become naturally resistant to billing fraud and other forms of service exploitation. The international attention has led to collaboration with communities in Ireland, Portugal, and other countries that face similar challenges with fashion's cost inflation and service fraud targeting residential areas. Our neighborhood's transformation from opposing home sewing as unnecessary to becoming a global model for fashion resilience demonstrates that practical education and community cooperation can address multiple challenges simultaneously, rather than requiring separate solutions for clothing and economic threats. Today, when Carlos and I talk to young families about choosing homes and building financial security, we always emphasize the connections between fashion awareness, clothing independence, and economic protection. Home sewing saved our family thousands of dollars in clothing costs, I tell them. But more importantly, it taught us that practical preparation and financial responsibility work together to create security that no single approach can provide. The sewing workshop that Karen once called noise pollution has become valued community infrastructure that provides both wardrobe benefits and economic protection for families throughout Tennessee and beyond. Sometimes being prepared really isn't about fear or anxiety. It's just about understanding economic realities and taking practical steps that protect your family from predictable challenges. But the most remarkable transformation occurred 16 years after our initial sewing confrontation, when Riverside Heights was selected as the pilot community for the National Fashion Accessibility Demonstrations Project, a federal initiative showcasing how residential communities can maintain clothing security and economic stability during increasingly severe economic disruptions. The selection committee, composed of representatives from the Department of Commerce, Small Business Administration, and the Federal Trade Commission, cited our neighborhood's comprehensive integration of sewing education, fraud prevention, and community resilience as the model for suburban fashion adaptation throughout the United States. During the selection process, federal officials interviewed dozens of families who had benefited from our community's fashion transformation, documenting how clothing expertise had protected residents from both economic emergencies and financial exploitation during multiple crisis events over the past decade. Riverside Heights represents the future of American suburban resilience, explained Dr. Michelle Rodriguez, the project's federal coordinator, during the announcement ceremony. This community has demonstrated that fashion education and economic protection aren't separate concerns. They're integrated solutions that create lasting security for families facing unpredictable challenges. The federal recognition brought additional resources to our neighborhood, including funding for expanded sewing facilities, advanced clothing technology systems, and comprehensive educational programs that would serve as templates for communities throughout the country. More importantly, the designation attracted international attention from countries facing similar challenges with fashion cost inflation and community economic vulnerability. Delegations from Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and the European Union visited Riverside Heights to study our integrated approach to clothing resilience and fraud prevention. Isabella and Diego, now in their mid-20s and recognized as leading experts in community fashion systems, were invited to present our neighborhood's transformation at the World Economic Forum in Davos, representing grassroots community solutions to global economic challenges. What we learned growing up in Riverside Heights, Isabella told the international audience, is that economic adaptation and fashion security work best when communities develop expertise rather than depending entirely on external systems. Clothing education gives families the knowledge they need to protect themselves from both economic challenges and financial exploitation. Diego added, the technology solutions that emerged from our neighborhood's crisis have now helped over 1,200 communities develop integrated monitoring systems that protect families from economic emergencies, supply disruptions, and service fraud simultaneously. Local expertise creates global resilience. Their presentation documented how the fashion monitoring systems developed in Riverside Heights had been adapted for use in refugee communities, urban fashion deserts, and rural areas facing economic displacement, demonstrating the universal applicability of community-based clothing security and economic protection strategies. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came when Karen Wilson was invited to address the International Association of Consumer Protection Agencies annual conference, representing community advocates who had learned the importance of fashion expertise through personal crisis and transformation. 16 years ago, I opposed clothing production in my neighborhood because I thought it made us look unstable, Karen told the audience of consumer protection professionals. I didn't understand that fashion stability requires preparation, not wishful thinking. My opposition to practical clothing security created the conditions that allowed both economic vulnerability and financial fraud to threaten families who trusted my judgment. Karen's presentation included detailed analysis of how her fashion fraud had succeeded, precisely because residents lacked the clothing knowledge needed to recognize billing irregularities and service manipulation. The case study demonstrated how fashion education could protect communities from multiple threats simultaneously. The most important lesson from Riverside Heights, Karen concluded, is that fashion expertise and community fraud prevention aren't separate skills, they are complementary forms of knowledge that protect families from both economic and financial threats that often target the same vulnerable populations. The conference audience, composed of consumer protection officials, fraud investigators, and community development professionals, gave Karen a standing ovation that lasted over 6 minutes. Recognizing both her personal transformation and the broader implications of her experience for community resilience education. Following the conference, Karen was appointed as the international spokesperson for the Global Community Fashion Resilience Initiative, a position that allowed her to share the Riverside Heights model with communities throughout the world. The long-term economic impact of our neighborhood's transformation became even more significant as fashion challenges intensified throughout the region and communities without clothing, preparedness faced increasingly severe wardrobe security and financial crises. Economic analysis conducted by Vanderbilt University showed that families in fashion-prepared communities like Riverside Heights experienced 65 to 85% less financial stress during economic emergencies compared to communities that relied solely on external clothing systems and professional services without resident expertise. More importantly, the analysis demonstrated that community fashion education created economic benefits that extended far beyond simple cost savings, including increased property values, reduced insurance premiums, and enhanced community cooperation that attracted businesses and investment to resilient neighborhoods. Property values in Riverside Heights had increased 45% above regional averages, with real estate agents specifically marketing our community's fashion infrastructure and clothing adaptation expertise as premium features that provided both lifestyle benefits and economic protection. The transformation attracted young families seeking communities that prioritize practical education and economic resilience, creating a demographic shift toward residents who valued fashion knowledge and community cooperation over purely aesthetic considerations. But the most profound long-term impact occurred when our neighborhood's children, who had grown up understanding fashion systems and economic adaptation, began pursuing careers that extended Riverside Heights' influence throughout the region and beyond. Besides Isabella and Diego, 14 other young adults from our community had chosen careers in fashion design, community development, economic adaptation, or fraud prevention, creating a professional network that continued expanding the Riverside Heights model throughout the southeastern United States. These professionals, who had experienced firsthand the benefits of community fashion education and economic protection, brought unique perspectives to their work that emphasized practical solutions over theoretical approaches and community expertise over external dependency. Their influence extended the Riverside Heights model to over 250 communities throughout Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, and Georgia, with each adaptation reflecting local economic conditions while maintaining the core principles of fashion education, economic monitoring, and community resilience. Carlos and I, now in our 50s, continued working to expand fashion education and financial literacy throughout the region. But our focus had shifted toward developing programs that could be implemented by communities without requiring specialized expertise or significant financial investment. The most important lesson we learned, Carlos explained during a recent interview about sustainable community development, is that fashion resilience doesn't require advanced technology or expensive infrastructure. It requires education, cooperation, and willingness to take responsibility for community clothing security rather than depending entirely on external systems. I added, what happened in Riverside Heights demonstrates that communities can address economic challenges and financial vulnerability simultaneously when residents develop practical expertise and work together to protect shared interests rather than competing for individual advantages. Our work had evolved to focus on developing simplified fashion education programs that could be implemented by any community, regardless of economic conditions, fashion resources, or existing expertise, making the Riverside Heights model accessible to families and neighborhoods throughout the country. The simplified programs included basic sewing techniques, financial monitoring systems, and community coordination protocols that could be adapted for different regions, while maintaining the essential elements that had made our neighborhood successful. But perhaps the most significant validation of our approach came when the Federal Emergency Management Agency incorporated community fashion education into their official disaster preparedness guidelines, recognizing clothing expertise as essential infrastructure for community resilience during economic emergencies. The FEMA guidelines, developed in consultation with fashion professionals from Riverside Heights and similar communities, established fashion education as a priority for federal disaster preparedness funding and community resilience planning. Communities with active clothing production programs show significantly better outcomes during economic emergencies, the guidelines stated. Fashion education helps residents maintain professional appearance and economic stability when external clothing systems are disrupted by economic events. The federal recognition meant that communities throughout the United States could access funding and technical assistance for implementing fashion education programs based on the Riverside Heights model, expanding our neighborhood's influence to a national scale. Today, 18 years after Karen's initial opposition to my sewing workshop, the fashion education principles that emerged from our neighborhood crisis have been implemented in over 2,500 communities throughout the United States and 20 countries internationally. The Riverside Heights model has been adapted for urban communities, rural areas, military installations, and economic development zones, demonstrating the universal applicability of community-based fashion education and economic protection strategies. More importantly, the communities that have implemented these programs show consistently better outcomes during economic emergencies, supply disruptions, and financial crises, with residents who understand fashion systems proving more resilient during multiple types of challenges. The sewing workshop that Karen once called noise pollution has become the symbol of a global movement toward community fashion resilience and economic protection that continues growing stronger with each new community that chooses practical preparation over wishful thinking. Remember, when good people refuse to be intimidated by fake authority and work together to develop practical solutions, they can build communities that thrive during uncertain times rather than simply surviving them. Thanks for watching HOA Revenge Stories, where we prove that every HOA Karen eventually meets their match, and sometimes that match changes the world.